Welcome to the Trivium. This is our second episode of this series, and I wanted to switch up the methodology a bit by asking 10 short questions with relatively shorter answers. I'm hoping this Trivium series will be something that's a little easier to do at a regular rate to cover a kind of broader swath of material. It was suggested that my next topic in this series would be maybe on the agricultural revolution or revolutions or something related to that. I've prepared some interesting questions. Let's go through them together. The first question is, what do Tel and Tepe mean? So this is like in words like Tel Abu Huraira, a site in Mesopotamia, or Göbekli Tepe. Does it mean settlement, rock formation, mound, or granary? Feel free to pause and answer to yourself. Now, here's the answer. Tel is Arabic for basically tall, hill, or mound. Tepe is Turkish for a hill or mound. So the answer is C. And these mounds form not just from literally intentionally being constructed as earthworks, which some of them in some ways are. They are tilled. They are mostly formed just by layers and layers of sediment from living and construction material and houses that are being constantly built on top of one another over time. A settlement in a certain area over time will kind of build up into this mound. Next question. How many independent agricultural revolutions were there? 1, 3, 9, or 11? Take your guess now. The answer is definitely not 1. There were at least 3: West Asian, East Asian, and Mesoamerican. And at most, the current estimate is 11. And I think realistically, it's maybe 9. And based on some of the research I did in preparation for this question, actually, I'm wondering if it might be 5. So, no absolute answer on this. It mostly depends on your definition of independent. When it comes to unique crops that are native to that region and were domesticated in that region, you get the 9 number. Each one of these agricultural revolution epicenters has a unique Neolithic package of its own. And I'm going to list these out in order of how early they're estimated to have happened. The oldest would be West Asian Neolithic, that's the Fertile Crescent. The southern China or Yangtze River Valley, that's where rice came from. Mesoamerica, so that's where squash actually first, and then later maize came from. Papua, also called New Guinea, where taro and bananas were cultivated. The Yellow River Valley in China, where millet was cultivated. The western Amazonian foothills of the Andes, where cassava was cultivated. The highland Andes area around Titicaca, where potatoes were cultivated. The Mississippi River Valley, and finally the Sahel and West African kind of Neolithic expansion, where sorghum in the Sahel and African rice in the Niger River Valley. So that's 9 centers that are generally accepted to have been generally independent. My suspicion is that some of these earlier revolutions might have spread and diffused and triggered revolutions in some other regions. So like in Mississippi Valley, for instance, they cultivated squash, and it wasn't much longer before they were cultivating maize. And it happened so much later, around like 3000 BC, whereas Mesoamerican cultivation of squash and maize was back in 8000 BC. The Mississippians may have simply adopted or even themselves migrated from Mesoamerican region. And then other examples like in West Africa and Sahel region, the agricultural revolution in that region started around 3000 BC, which is way later than the West Asian Fertile Crescent agricultural revolution around 10,000 to 8,000 BC. although a lot of the crops were domesticated locally, it may have been triggered by trade and interaction with other farmers in the Nile and towards the Middle East. And the same thing might go for the Yellow River Valley in China, developing their own millet-based agriculture, but being influenced or triggered potentially by the southern Yangtze River rice cultivation. So that's my hypothesis. That maybe brings it down to 5, since in my modeling of diffusion potential in these situations, it's a bit less likely that the Mesoamerican agricultural revolution triggered the Western Amazonian Andean one, for instance, or southern China rice cultivation triggered the Papuan agricultural revolution, right? So I think the Papuan and the Amazonian Andean one might be truly independent, which would cut us down to 5. But again, this is actively being researched, so there's no absolute answer here. That's just my best guess. I think that'll be the longest answer. Next question is, who were the first farmers in the West Asian Neolithic? So that's the Fertile Crescent. Sumerians, Natufians, Tashtepler, or Nubians? The answer that most agree with is Natufians. The Natufians lived in Canaan in the Levant, and they were the first to experiment with agricultural crops like wheat and barley and such, also various fruits and nuts. And they had been experimenting with it in a very semi-nomadic way, like hunter-gathering kind of way, since arguably 20,000 BC or earlier, which is crazy. There's some caves that have evidence of them. But it wasn't until about 10,000 and 8,000 BC that they kind of started settling and transitioning towards more permanent agriculture. It would have started as permaculture, which is kind of just all kinds of things, trees and grasses and bushes, kind of just spread around and seasonally gathered, maybe traveling from one valley to another. The Tashtepler, and that's the general term for many of the sites like Göbekli Tepe, actually followed the Natufians. So we talked about Tel Abu Harira. That is where the Natufians settled in Mesopotamia, and that influenced Göbekli Tepe to the north. The Sumerians followed the Tashtepler and the Natufians. So it took time for agriculture to spread from upper Mesopotamia to lower Mesopotamia, where Sumer is. And then Nubians. Now that one is actually a close second answer, because there are some hypotheses out there suggesting that some grasses were domesticated in the Nile River Valley. And that hypothesis is based on the linguistic hypothesis that the Afro-Asiatic languages actually originated from Africa, somewhere along the Nile, perhaps even as far as Ethiopia. The general consensus is that the Afro-Asiatic languages originated in the Levant and correspond with the Natufian culture, and that those languages spread into Africa and elsewhere alongside shepherdry and agriculture. Next question. Who were the first farmers in the East Asian Neolithic? Han Chinese, Manchus, Yangtzeans, or Austroasians? My answer would broadly probably be Yangtzeans, because they correspond with the Yangtze River Neolithic, which we mentioned was the first agricultural revolution in East Asia. Now, the second one in East Asia was in the Yellow River Valley, which is the homeland of the ancestral Han Chinese. But Yangtzean also is a term for a specific linguistic group, the Hmong-Mien language family, which is often considered an isolate, but there is a linguistic hypothesis that 4 language groups all descended from some common proto-language in southern China. And this general language family group is called Austric. Those 4 language groups would be Hmong-Mien or Yangtzean, Tai Kadai, Austronesian, and Austroasiatic. There's ever more evidence showing that Thai, Kadai, and Austronesian are related, and some DNA testing shows that Neolithic populations originating in the middle Yangtze River share ancestry with various members of these language families. Really, it's C and D and maybe E, Proto-Austric speaking people. But that's, again, very highly speculative, wide sweeping hypothesis. It would have been between 10 and 8,000 BC or earlier that would have been happening. So around the same time that the Afro-Asiatic languages would have theoretically been spreading in West Asia, which to me means it's not a crazy hypothesis, but it certainly is my favorite. Number 5, we're halfway through, so now it's a speed round. What was the first domesticated plant in the world? Apple, fig, barley, or rice? It's actually fig, and it's a little blurry, really, how we define something being domesticated or not, because something could be a wild fruit or grass or nut that is gathered and consumed, and maybe even accidentally or even intentionally spread. But generally, in terms of active cultivation, the fig takes the cake at 11,500 BC in the Jordan River Valley, actually. Next question is, which of these was the first animal to be domesticated? Goats, sheep, cows, or chickens? The answer is goats. They actually beat out sheep by give or take 500 years. Cows were then about 500 years after that, and chickens 2,000 years after that. And chickens actually were traded from East Asia ultimately to West Asia. Goats, cows, and sheep were also traded to East Asia from Central Asia eventually. Goats were domesticated somewhere in the Zagros Mountains of Iran. Sheep, possibly in Upper Mesopotamia, just north of Göbekli Tepe. Cows around the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia. So yeah, a lot of the highlands around the Fertile Crescent are actually where a lot of animal husbandry came about. Next question. Which animal was first yoked to a wagon? Horse, ox, donkey, or water buffalo? This one's honestly kind of easy. It's actually ox. Oxen are castrated bulls. That makes them more docile, more easy to manage. I won't tell you where just yet because I think that will come up in another question. Speaking of donkeys, the next question is, what is an asshole? What it sounds like? People who talk about the Anunnaki but don't know anything about Sumerian mythology? A hole that donkeys dig, or a cave where donkeys were kept? A, B, and C all are an answer, and I suppose you could put donkeys in a cave and call it an asshole. So really all of them are true, but an asshole originally actually is a hole dug by a donkey in a desert to get water. Basically dig up wells in the desert, and other animals follow them around and partake of the watering holes that they supply. So this is part of why the mythology of donkeys, they represent benevolence and generosity toward the poor and such. They're very social animals, and they basically get along with anything. Next question. Where were the first wheels invented? Sumer, Europe, Anatolia, or China? The first place that we know for sure oxen were yoked to wagons with solid wheels on them, an axle with 2 wheels, was in Sumer. So that's kind of the textbook answer. However, we see wheels pop up in the archaeological record throughout Europe exactly the same time as they are popping up in Sumer. And also around the same time, we have little toys in Anatolia and Europe that show wheeled vehicles, little wagons with little wheels on them. And so that kind of indicates to us that wherever it started, it spread very quickly, which makes sense because it's a wheel. It would have spread quickly. It would have been a very useful technology, and it would have literally allowed people to spread faster. And all of this happened around 3300 BC. So relatively late on the stage in the Bronze Age and Chalcolithic. My hunch, though, is that it might have actually been a bit older and originated around Anatolia, the same place where aurochs were domesticated into cows, because this is the place in between Sumer and Europe. And the Europeans were early Neolithic farmers who descended from Anatolian Neolithic farmers. Perhaps they used wheels to get there. Now, of course, that would have been more around 7,000, 6,000 BC. Could wheels have been 2,000 years earlier? I don't know. If not, nonetheless, it must have spread from Anatolia into Europe. So, textbook answer, Sumer. My personal answer, Anatolia. Question number 10, the final question. Which of the following is a New World crop? So it originated in the Americas. Sugarcane, coffee, tomatoes, or cotton? The answer is tomatoes. Tomatoes were cultivated, I believe, either by that Western Amazonian Andean group or the Highland Andes group that was with potatoes. Potatoes and tomatoes were kind of together in a Neolithic package in South America. Sugarcane is from Papua or Indonesia, cotton is from India, and coffee is actually from Arabia and Ethiopia. There is a strand of coffee that is grown in the Americas nowadays, but it is descended from Old World coffee. How well did you do in this trivia? Not gonna lie, I'm realize now that I am quite a bit of an agriculture nerd. There's actually a video slash podcast that me and Callie did about the staple crops of the world, and it kind of just mapped out some of the most important crops from various cultures. You can also watch my first episode of the trivia series where I go into detail about the oldest city in Mesopotamia question, which of course bridges into the topic of agricultural revolution and the first settlements. These videos tend to be quite niche. So what topic of trivia would you suggest I do next? I might have to go for half the amount of questions next time, maybe 5, or some other interesting number like 7. That's a fun number. I'll see you next time. Bye.